Nobody warned her. Not the crowd that had gathered 3 deep along the gilded iron railings. Not the tourists with their cameras already raised, already recording. Not the 2 women standing beside her who had nudged each other and whispered, "Don't do it, don't do it," as if they already sensed what was coming. Nobody warned the royal guard either, not that it would have mattered. He was trained to stand still. He stood still. And then, a woman's hand connected with his cheek, sharpened, flat, in front of 200 witnesses, 3 news cameras, and 1 very startled pigeon that launched itself off the stone ledge above and did not come back. For exactly 1 second, London went quiet. Then, it didn't. What happened in the minutes, hours, and days that followed that slap, that one impulsive, furious, deeply human moment, is not a story about a royal guard. It is not even really a story about the woman who slapped him, though she is at the center of it. It is a story about what happens when a single act of desperation catches fire in public, when the cameras are already rolling, when the crowd has already made up its mind, and when the truth turns out to be something none of them had considered. Some moments look simple from the outside. This was not one of them. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in central London. The kind of morning that tricks you with pale sunshine and, then, drops the temperature the moment you step outside without a proper coat. The tourists were already out in force near the palace gates, the way they always were, phones raised, children on shoulders, selfie sticks pointing in every direction like a field of metal sunflowers. A queue of red double-decker buses crawled past in the background, indifferent to history and ceremony the way London buses always are. The royal guard standing at his post that morning was doing what royal guards are trained to do. He was still. Not quiet. Stillness and quiet are different things, and any guard who has stood at that post long enough knows the distinction. The world around him was loud. Tourists talked, buses rumbled, pigeons argued. He did not move. He did not blink more than necessary. He stared at a fixed point somewhere above the heads of the crowd and held his body like something carved out of the same stone as the walls behind him. His name was James Whitmore. 24 years old. 3rd year of service. He had stood this post more than 200 times. He had been shouted at, laughed at, photographed from every possible angle, and once had an entire birthday cake held up in front of his face while a group of tourists sang happy birthday in 3 different languages. He had not moved then, either. He did not expect Tuesday to be different. The woman who changed his Tuesday arrived at the gates at 10:30. Her name was Margaret Osei, though in the days that followed, the newspapers would call her many things before they got around to her name. She was 41 years old. She was wearing a gray coat that had seen better winters, a pair of flat shoes that were sensible rather than fashionable, and an expression that the people standing nearest to her would later describe, in separate interviews, with the same word, desperate. Margaret had come to London from Birmingham. She had woken up at 5 a.m, caught the first coach she could afford, and arrived at Victoria Station with a folder of documents tucked under her arm and the particular look of someone who has spent months being politely redirected from one office to another and has run out of patience for redirection. She was not a woman given to dramatic gestures. Her neighbors back home, when later asked, all said the same thing: quiet woman, keeps to herself, always has time for a word but never makes trouble. Her sister said she hadn't raised her voice in an argument since 2017. She had not planned to go to the palace that morning. That detail matters more than it might seem. What Margaret had planned was to deliver her folder of documents, medical letters, appeal rejections, records dating back 4 years, to a government office on the other side of St. James's Park. She had an appointment. She had confirmed the appointment twice by phone. When she arrived at the building, she was told, by a young man who seemed genuinely sorry about it, that the department had relocated 3 weeks ago and that her appointment had been automatically cancelled and she should have received an email notification. She had not received an email notification. She stood on the pavement outside the empty office building for several minutes. Then, she began to walk. She walked the way people walk when they are trying not to cry in public, head slightly up, pace slightly too fast, jaw set. She walked through St. James's Park without seeing the ducks or the trees or the pale morning light on the water. She came off the other side and found herself at the palace gates without quite having decided to go there. Later, she would not be able to explain it clearly. She said she just needed to stand somewhere official. Somewhere that felt like it mattered. She was not the first person in history to be drawn to a symbol when the substance had failed them. The crowd around the gates was the usual mix. A family from Japan, a student group from Germany, two elderly American women taking turns photographing each other. A young man selling bottled water from a fold-up stand. Three teenage boys daring each other to see who could get the closest to the guard's face without him reacting, which is a game that teenagers have been playing at that post for as long as there have been teenagers and guards. Margaret stood at the railings. She held her folder against her chest. She looked at James Whitmore the way people sometimes look at things that are meant to represent something larger, not really seeing the person, seeing the idea the person stands for. Power. Authority. The country that had, in her experience, spent 4 years telling her that her son's condition was not severe enough, not documented enough, not categorized correctly enough to qualify for the support she had been applying for since he was diagnosed. Her son, Daniel, was 16. He had a degenerative muscle condition. He used a wheelchair. The flat they lived in had no lift and no ground floor availability on any waiting list Margaret had been able to find. The council had been reviewing their case for 14 months. The most recent letter, the one she had received 6 days ago and, which was now in the folder pressed against her chest, had informed her that due to a processing backlog, their case had been deferred for a further review period of up to 18 months. She had 3 flights of stairs in her building and a 16-year-old son who was losing the ability to climb them. None of the crowd at the palace gates knew any of this. They saw a woman in a gray coat standing at the railings, gripping a folder, staring at the guard. Some of them noticed her. Most didn't. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Margaret Osei stepped forward, not toward the guard, but the railings, gripping them with one hand. She said something. Only the people immediately beside her heard it clearly, and what they heard was, "Someone needs to listen." Then, her arm came back and her hand went forward and she slapped James Whitmore across the left cheek with an open palm. The sound carried. Not the way movie slaps carry, that sharp cinematic crack engineered in a sound studio. The real sound was flatter, less theatrical, and somehow worse for it. It was the sound of a woman's hand against a young man's face in the cold morning air, and it landed in the middle of a dozen conversations and stopped all of them. James Whitmore did not move. This is the thing that people kept talking about afterward, in all the footage, in all the accounts. He did not step back. He did not raise a hand. He did not change his expression. He had been trained, rigorously and repeatedly, to hold his post regardless of provocation, and he held it. His eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance, moved just slightly to her face. Just a fraction. And then, returned to where they had been. Margaret stood there for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Her hand was still raised. The folder had fallen. Papers were sliding across the stone paving in the light wind. And she was looking at James Whitmore's face, really looking at it, maybe for the first time, and she began to cry. Not the dramatic crying of someone performing grief. The quiet, helpless kind. The kind that arrives before you've decided to let it. 2 officers who had been stationed nearby were already moving. A tourist had already pressed record. The young man selling water had his phone out. One of the teenage boys said something to the others in a hushed voice, and all 3 of them went quiet. The crowd, which had spent the last hour doing what crowds at tourist sites always do, cheerful, distracted, in their own separate worlds, became, in those 20 seconds, a single thing watching a single moment. And what they were watching was not what they thought they were watching. That is the thing about moments that go public. They freeze at the surface. They get shared as the surface. The slap was the surface. What was underneath it, the folder of letters, the 4 years, the 3 flights of stairs, the 16-year-old boy, that part wasn't in the frame. The 2 officers reached Margaret. They were, by every account, calm and professional. They did not handle her roughly. One of them picked up the papers that had scattered from the folder, gathered them carefully, and handed them back to her before she was taken aside. She did not resist. She was not shouting. She was barely speaking. James Whitmore had still not moved. The crowd dispersed slowly, the way crowds do after witnessing something that doesn't fit into the day they had planned. The German students walked away talking in low voices. The American women looked at each other and didn't take any more photographs. The Japanese family stayed a little longer. The father watched James Whitmore with an expression that was hard to read. The footage, all 7 different angles of it, was online within the hour. By noon, Margaret O'Sea's face was on every platform. By 2 in the afternoon, the phrase "woman slaps royal guard" had been searched more than 400,000 times. By the evening news cycle, there were already 2 camps forming in the comments and, on the call-in shows, those who saw a woman who had committed an inexcusable act of assault against a serviceman, and those who were asking why she had done it. The debate was loud and fast and thoroughly certain of itself in both directions. In a holding room near the gate, Margaret sat with her folder in her lap and her hands clasped together, and, when an officer asked if she needed anything, she asked whether she could call her sister. She was told she could. She made the call. She said, in a voice her sister described as the most tired she had ever heard from her, "I did something. I need you to know I didn't mean for it to go like this." Her sister asked what happened. Margaret said, "I just needed someone to listen." The officer sitting across from her heard this. He wrote it down in his notes, not because it was legally significant, but because it seemed important in the way that simple true things sometimes are. James Whitmore, for his part, had been relieved from his post after the incident as per standard protocol. He was checked by the duty medic. He confirmed he was uninjured. He was asked if he wanted to make a statement. He sat quietly for a moment, and then he said that he would like to know if the woman was all right. This was also written down. Also not legally significant. Also important. Outside, the city carried on. The buses ran. The pigeons returned to the stone ledge. Another shift of tourists arrived at the gates, and most of them didn't know anything had happened. The footage was running on its own timeline now, gathering comments and opinions and reactions the way a river gathers everything in its path. It would run for days. And the story it was carrying, the real one, the full one, the one that had 3 flights of stairs and a 16-year-old and 4 years of letters in it, that story was only just beginning to come into focus. Margaret O'Sea spent 3 hours in that room. She was charged with common assault. She was released on the condition that she appear at a magistrate's hearing the following month. She was given back her folder. She walked out into the afternoon alone, caught a bus to Victoria, and sat in the coach station for an hour before the next Birmingham service departed. She did not check her phone. She did not know, yet, what was happening to her face on the internet. She did not know about the 2 journalists who were already trying to find her address. She did not know about the woman in Edinburgh who had watched the footage 3 times and then started a crowdfunding page. She did not know that a former civil servant who had worked in housing allocation for 20 years had watched the footage and posted a thread about it that was being shared faster than almost anything else that day. She only knew that she had done something she could not undo, that her son was at home waiting for her, and that she still had not spoken to anyone official who had the power to actually help. The coach pulled out of Victoria at 5:30. London fell behind in the dark. Margaret O'Sea pressed her forehead against the window and closed her eyes, and the folder rested on her knees, and outside the motorway lights moved past in long orange streaks, regular as breathing, steady as something that doesn't know it's being watched. By the time Margaret O'Sea arrived back in Birmingham, the world had already decided who she was. This is the part of the story that moves faster than the people in it. The footage had been uploaded 7 times by 7 different people before she even boarded her coach. Each upload had a slightly different caption. The most shared one said simply, "Woman attacks royal guard at palace. Watch to the end." It had been viewed, by the time she pressed her forehead against the coach window and closed her eyes, just over 200,000 times. By midnight, that number would be closer to 3 million. The internet, as it always does, sorted itself into positions before it had sorted itself into facts. On one side, outrage. A young man in uniform, standing perfectly still, doing his job, struck by a stranger in front of hundreds of people. It didn't matter why. It couldn't matter why. You could not go around hitting servicemen because you were having a bad day. The comments on that side were fast and certain and frequently all in capital letters. There were calls for a harsher charge than common assault. There were people who had never been to London, had never seen a Royal Guard post, and had extremely strong opinions about what should happen to this woman now. On the other side, questions. Why did she do it? What was in that folder? Why was she crying before the officers reached her? Those questions moved more slowly, they always do, but they moved. A woman named Caroline Hargreaves, who had spent 22 years working in the Housing Benefits Department of a London borough before taking early retirement, watched the footage on her kitchen tablet while eating her breakfast. She watched it twice. She watched the way Margaret held that folder. She watched the way the papers scattered. She watched the crying. She had seen that specific kind of crying before, in waiting rooms, in offices, on the other side of her desk, and she knew what it meant. She posted a comment that said, "That is not someone who woke up wanting to cause trouble. That is someone at the absolute end of their rope. I'd want to know her story before I judged her." Then, she went to work. Her comment was shared 40,000 times by noon. By afternoon, a journalist named Priya Mehta at a midsize online publication had tracked down enough information to know that Margaret O'Shea had a disabled son, had been involved in an ongoing housing appeal, and had traveled from Birmingham that morning for an appointment that had been cancelled without adequate notification. Priya was a careful journalist. She did not publish until she had spoken to Margaret's sister, who confirmed the broad outlines of the situation and gave a brief statement on Margaret's behalf. The article went up at 4 in the afternoon. It changed the conversation. Not overnight, not completely, but it changed it the way a current changes when a new tributary joins, the direction shifts slightly, and then, a little more, and then, suddenly, you're going somewhere different from where you started. The comments under Priya's article were different from the comments under the footage. They were longer. They were slower. They were the kind of comments written by people who had read the whole thing before typing. Some of them told their own stories, housing appeals that had gone nowhere, disability assessments that had returned impossible verdicts, letters from departments that seemed to have been generated by a machine that had never met a person. The thread became something people returned to through the day, adding their own fragments to a larger picture. Margaret, unaware of all of this, got home to Birmingham at 8:15 in the evening. Daniel was awake, sitting in his wheelchair at the kitchen table with his phone and a bowl of cereal that he'd managed to make himself. He was 16 and possessed of the specific dignity of teenagers who do not want their parents to worry about them even when there is plenty to worry about. He looked up when she came in. He took in the coat, the folder, her face. He said, "Mom. What happened?" She sat down across from him at the kitchen table. She told him. Not all of it. She left out the part about the slap for a full 30 seconds before deciding he would find out anyway, and it was better to hear it from her. When she got to that part, she said it plainly, without drama. She had slapped a Royal Guard. She was charged. She had a court date. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then, he said, "Are you okay?" She said she was fine. He nodded slowly, the way he'd nodded since he was small when he was processing something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. Then, he picked up his phone and did what 16-year-olds do when they need to understand something. He looked it up. Within 2 minutes he had found the footage. Within 5 minutes he had found Priya's article. Within 10 minutes he had found the crowdfunding page, which was now at £12,000. He turned the phone around and showed her. Margaret looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. The number was still climbing, refreshing every few seconds. There were names she didn't know, from places she'd never been to. Edinburgh. Cork. Melbourne. A small town in Canada whose name she couldn't pronounce. People who had watched a 7-second clip of her worst moment and had decided to respond to it not with judgment but with the most practical thing they could think of. She said, very quietly, "Why are they doing this?" Daniel, who was 16 and had grown up watching his mother fill in forms and attend appointments and write careful letters and receive careful rejections, said, "Because you did what a lot of people wanted to do and couldn't." She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure whether it was comfort or an accusation, and she thought it might be both. She went to bed at 10. She did not sleep. The next morning, everything was different. Priya Mehta had written a follow-up piece, published at 7 a.m., which included a more detailed account of the housing situation and a comment from a housing charity's spokesperson about the systemic backlog in disability adaptation cases. A radio station in Birmingham called Margaret's sister at 8 and asked if Margaret was available for comment. She was not. By 9, 2 television news programs had both picked up the story, not the original clip, they had all run that already, but the fuller version, the one with the 4 years and the missed appointment and Daniel and the stairs. On the same morning, James Whitmore's mother gave a brief statement to a tabloid. It was a short statement, and it was measured, and it was not what the tabloid had perhaps been hoping for. She said that her son was fine. She said that she hoped the courts would deal with the matter fairly. And, she said, and this was the part that became, in its own way, as widely shared as anything else, that her son had told her he would like to know what was in that folder. That he had asked her to try to find out. That he didn't think the story was what it looked like. The tabloid ran it under a headline that emphasized the assault. But, the statement circulated separately, passed from one person to the next, stripped of the headline. Just the words. Just the 24-year-old guardsman's mother saying that her son wanted to know what was in that folder. The crowdfunding page hit £30,000 by midday. Margaret's sister, whose name was Grace, had taken the day off work to field calls that Margaret herself could not face. Grace was 6 years older than Margaret, more comfortable with public attention, and possessed of a directness that Margaret had always envied. She gave one interview, to a local Birmingham station, filmed in her own sitting room with a cup of tea she didn't drink. She spoke clearly and, without self-pity. She described the 4 years. She described Daniel. She described the specific cruelty of a system that responds to urgency with forms and defers action with process. She said, "My sister is not a violent person. She has never been in trouble. She is a woman who has been trying to do the right thing, the right way, for a very long time, and she reached a point where she didn't know what else to do. I'm not saying what she did was right. I'm saying I understand it. And I think a lot of people do too." The interview was clipped and shared 300,000 times. In all the noise, something was also happening more quietly. A senior caseworker at the relevant government housing department, who had not been involved in Margaret's case but had become aware of it through the news coverage, pulled the file. She did not make public statements. She did not give interviews. She simply read the file with fresh eyes that had not been tired by process, that were not scheduled to attend 3 other meetings that afternoon. She made notes. She flagged several things that, in the ordinary run of the backlog, had been overlooked. She sent an internal email. Margaret did not know this was happening. She was sitting in her flat, 3 floors up, with her folder on the table in front of her, reading through the comments on Priya's article one by one with a kind of bewildered care, as though she were translating something from a language she knew but had not expected to hear spoken to her. People were kind. Not all of them, there were still the certain voices, the ones who had made their decision in the first 7 seconds and did not require additional information. But most of them were kind. Most of them had taken the time to read the whole thing and had written something that reflected that. A woman from Leeds wrote, "I went through 3 years of this with my husband. I never had the courage to do what you did. I'm glad someone did." A man from Swansea wrote, "My daughter is in a chair too. I've written 67 letters. Your story is my story. Thank you for being heard even if it wasn't the way you planned." A teacher from Norfolk wrote, "I showed this to my class today. We talked about what desperation looks like from the outside versus the inside." They had a lot to say. Margaret read these slowly. She read all the way to the bottom of the comments thread, which took her over an hour. Daniel came and sat beside her partway through, and she let him read over her shoulder without comment. When she finished, she closed the laptop. She said, "I still have a court date." Daniel said, "I know." She said, "This doesn't fix that." He said, "No." A pause. The flat was quiet. Outside, the sounds of the street, a delivery van, children somewhere, a television through the wall from the neighbors. She said, "But it feels different now." He asked her what she meant. She thought about it for a moment. "Then," she said, "when I was standing at those gates, I felt like I was shouting into a wall. Like there was nobody on the other side. And then, I did this stupid, terrible thing, and now there are all these people." She gestured at the closed laptop. "I don't know what to do with that." Daniel didn't say anything. He reached over and covered her hand with his, the way he used to when he was small, and she was the one doing the comforting and the roles hadn't reversed yet. She let him. There was one more thing that happened that day, smaller than the crowdfunding and the interviews and the caseworker's email, but the thing that Margaret would later say stayed with her the longest. Late in the afternoon, a letter arrived. Not an email, an actual letter, typed on plain paper, in an envelope with a London postmark. There was no return address. Inside was a single page. It said, "My son stood at that post for 6 years. He told me once that the hardest part of the job wasn't the cold or the standing, it was not being able to respond when someone clearly needed someone to respond to. He left the service last year. He is well. I don't know what you are going through. But I saw your face when the papers fell, and I thought you should know that someone was trying to respond, even if the uniform didn't allow it. I hope things get better for you and your family." It was not signed. Margaret read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the folder with the other letters. Not filed under rejections or appeals or case numbers. Just placed in there, between the pages, without a label. Grace called that evening and said a legal charity had offered to provide representation for Margaret's court appearance, pro bono, as a result of the coverage. The barrister who had volunteered was a specialist in public interest cases and had considerable experience with systemic failures in housing allocation. She said she had followed the case and believed there were grounds to argue Margaret's actions in a fuller context. Margaret listened. She said she would think about it. Grace said, "There's nothing to think about. Say yes." She said yes. The crowdfunding page, by the time she went to bed that second night, was at £47,000. She still hadn't spoken to a single official with the power to help. But the folder on her kitchen table, the one that had scattered across the paving stones in front of 200 strangers, the one that a police officer had gathered and returned to her quietly before she was taken aside, that folder had been seen now. Not just held under her arm, not just carried through appointment after appointment, not just slid across desks to people who had stamped and redirected and deferred. It had been seen. And the people who had seen it had not looked away. She turned off the light in the kitchen. She stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the street. 3 floors down, the ordinary life of the city. She thought about the guard's face, James Whitmore's face, in the moment when his eyes had moved, just slightly, just that fraction, to look at her. She had been thinking about that small movement for 2 days. About what it cost him, within his training and his discipline and his post, to let himself do even that much. She did not know what happened to him after. She didn't know he had asked about the folder. She didn't know about his mother's statement. She would find out. But that was the next part of the story. She just stood at the window for now, and let the street be the street, and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running very hard in the wrong direction for a very long time and has only just stopped. The magistrate's court in central Birmingham was not a dramatic building. It was the kind of place that had processed 10,000 small human crises before Margaret O'Say's and would process 10,000 more after, in the same beige corridors with the same institutional lighting and the same worn seats in the waiting area. It did not look like a place where anything important happened. Most places where important things happen don't. Margaret arrived 40 minutes early. She was wearing the same gray coat. She had thought briefly about buying something else, something that read differently, but Grace had told her not to be silly. It was a coat, not a costume, and she was right. The barrister who had volunteered her services, a woman named Diana Chaby, was already waiting outside. She was compact and unhurried and shook Margaret's hand as though they were meeting for coffee rather than preparing to stand in front of a magistrate together. Diane had called 3 times in the preceding weeks to go over everything. She had read the full housing file. She had spoken to the housing charity, to 2 former caseworkers, and to a specialist in disability law. She had also, quietly, made a formal complaint on Margaret's behalf about the cancellation of the appointment without adequate notification, a complaint that was already working its way through an internal review process that would not conclude before today but whose existence was already noted in the documentation she carried. She had told Margaret, on their last call, "I'm not going to make you out to be a saint." That's not the argument. The argument is context. Real context, documented context, 4 years of it. The court needs to see the whole picture, not just the 7 seconds. The hearing lasted just over an hour. Margaret sat and listened while Diane presented the case not as an excuse, but as a landscape. The housing situation, the years of appeals, the missed appointment, the 3 flights of stairs. The letter about the further 18-month deferment. The fact that on the morning in question, Margaret had traveled to London in good faith, for a legitimate purpose, and had been turned away through administrative failure. The fact that she had no prior record of any kind. The fact that the moment of the slap was, in Diane's carefully chosen words, the action of a woman who had exhausted every available avenue and reached a point where a single irrational act seemed like the only thing left. James Whitmore was not present. He had submitted a written statement. The magistrate read it without expression, but she read it fully, and she did not rush past it. His statement said that he did not feel he had suffered any significant harm. It said he believed the matter should be considered in the full context of what had led to it. It said, and this was the line that Diane had read aloud in her preparation with Margaret, quietly, because she thought Margaret should be ready for it. It said that in his own assessment, the most significant thing about the incident was not the slap but the folder. The magistrate took a 20-minute recess. When she returned, she delivered a conditional discharge. No fine. No custodial sentence. A formal acknowledgement of the assault and an equally formal recognition of the exceptional circumstances. She addressed Margaret directly, which was not always the way these things went, and she said something that the court reporter noted carefully and that Priya Mehta would quote in her article the following morning: "What happened outside those gates was wrong. But the conditions that produced it are also wrong. And this court is not equipped to address those conditions, but others are, and I would encourage them to do so." Margaret said nothing. She did not cry. She had cried already, the night before, in Grace's kitchen, when she had finally let herself think about what it would feel like for it to be over. By the time she was actually standing in that court, she had no tears left for the moment. She just stood, and listened, and nodded, and when it was done she walked out into the corridor with Diane at her side. Grace was waiting in the corridor. She had brought Daniel. This was not planned, it was not the kind of thing you bring a 16-year-old to, but Daniel had asked to come and Grace had decided that he had a right to be there and nobody was going to tell a 16-year-old in a wheelchair that he couldn't witness the outcome of the thing that had upended his mother's life. He had gotten himself dressed in a shirt, which Margaret noticed and which she thought was the most quietly dignified thing she had ever seen. She crossed the corridor and crouched down to his level and they stayed like that for a moment without speaking. Then, he said, "So it's done?" And she said, "It's done." And he said, very simply, "Good." They went out into the gray Birmingham morning together. But the story, in the way of real stories, the ones that are not tidy, did not end there. The same morning as the hearing, an email arrived in Margaret's inbox. It was from the housing department. Not the standard automated letter, the kind that begins with a case number and references an assessment period. This was from a named person, the senior caseworker who had pulled the file 3 weeks earlier and had sent the internal email. Her name was Susan Park. The email was 4 paragraphs long. It acknowledged the length of time Margaret's case had been in the system. It noted that a fresh internal review had been completed. It said that a housing liaison officer had been assigned to the case specifically. And it said that a ground floor accommodation with the necessary adaptations had been identified as available, and that subject to a final visit and paperwork, which they hoped to complete within the following 2 weeks, it would be offered to Margaret and Daniel on a priority basis. Margaret did not read this email until that evening. She had left her phone off during the hearing and had forgotten to turn it back on until she was home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had made and, then, not drunk. When she read it 3 times. Then, she put the phone face down on the table. Then, she picked it up and read it again. She called Grace. She read it to her over the phone. There was a long silence on the line, and then, Grace said, "Oh, thank God." And then, Grace began to cry, which Grace almost never did, and Margaret listened to her sister cry and found that she was smiling. Not a wide smile. A quiet one. The kind that arrives before you've given it permission. She went to Daniel's room and knocked. She read him the email standing in the doorway. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened to important things. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "We're going to have to carry my stuff down 3 flights. She laughed. It surprised her how completely and genuinely she laughed. The 2 weeks the email mentioned stretched to 6 weeks in practice, because this is how these things go: the paperwork, the visits, the forms that reference other forms that reference other forms. But, the direction did not change. Susan Park kept her word. The liaison officer answered emails within 24 hours, which was new. The flat that was identified was on the ground floor of a building 10 minutes walk from Daniel's school. It had a kitchen Margaret cried in when she first walked through it, not because it was beautiful, it was very ordinary, but because the door was wide enough for Daniel's chair and there were no stairs between the outside world and the place where they would sleep. They moved in on a Saturday in early spring. The crowdfunding money, which had reached £52,000 by the time the page was closed, had been a conversation Margaret had approached with considerable discomfort. She was not accustomed to receiving things. Grace had handled most of it, in consultation with the organizer, a woman from Edinburgh named Fiona who had set up the page after watching the footage and had cried at her kitchen table and decided to do something practical about it. The money went toward Daniel's medical equipment and the adaptations the new flat required, and a portion of it, on Fiona's suggestion, was donated to the housing charity that had supported their legal case. Margaret spoke to Fiona once by phone, a 40-minute call that neither of them had planned to be 40 minutes. Fiona said she had a brother with a similar condition and had been through a smaller version of the same system and knew the weight of it. Margaret said she didn't know how to thank her. Fiona said there was nothing to thank her for, which is what people say when they mean the opposite. The thing that Margaret had not expected, the thing that she kept coming back to in the months that followed, when people occasionally asked her how she felt about all of it, was James Whitmore. She had written him a letter. This was not something Diane had suggested or Grace had organized. It was something Margaret decided to do herself, in the middle of a Tuesday night 2 weeks after the hearing, when she couldn't sleep and found herself sitting at the kitchen table again with the folder in front of her. She wrote the letter by hand, which took longer than she expected because she kept stopping and starting. She did not ask him to forgive her. She said she understood if he didn't, that she wasn't sure she deserved it, that what she had done was wrong and she knew it was wrong. She said she was sorry for the specific violence of it, for the fact that he had been the nearest visible symbol of a system she couldn't reach and had borne something that was not meant for him personally. She said she was grateful for his statement to the court, which she knew he had not been obligated to give. She said she hoped the whole thing had not been too much of a disruption to his life. She sent it to the address Diane was able to obtain through proper channels. She received a reply 3 weeks later. His handwriting was neater than she expected. He said he appreciated the letter. He said he hadn't held it against her, that he'd understood from the beginning that she hadn't been hitting him, she'd been hitting something he was standing in front of. He said he was glad things were getting better. He said, and this was the part she had not expected, that she read twice and then folded into the envelope and kept. He said that he had gone back to his superiors after the incident and asked whether there was any way for guards at that post to have access to basic public information resources. Some kind of card or referral, something small, so that when someone arrived at those gates clearly in crisis, there was some way to direct them somewhere useful rather than standing in silence and watching them get arrested. He said the proposal had not gone anywhere yet, but he was still working on it. She put his letter in the folder. Not under case numbers or appeal records. At the front. First thing you'd see if you opened it. There was a journalist, not Priya, a different one, a documentary filmmaker who had been following the story for 3 months, who asked Margaret, toward the end of filming, what she would say to anyone who had watched that original clip and made their mind up in the first 7 seconds. Margaret thought about it for a while. She was not a quotable person by nature. She was thoughtful and plain-spoken, and she distrusted things that sounded too good to be a real answer. She sat with the question long enough that the filmmaker thought she might not answer at all. Then, she said, I'd say, look at what people did with 7 seconds of watching me at my worst. They didn't have to do any of that. Nobody asked them. They just decided something needed to be done and they did it. And that's not a small thing. In the middle of everything that happened, that's not a small thing at all. She paused. And I'd say, if someone in your life is carrying a folder like mine, full of letters that all say no in different ways, don't wait for them to do something dramatic. Ask earlier. Just ask earlier. The documentary aired 6 months later. The filmmaker sent Margaret a copy before it went public. She watched it alone, at the kitchen table, the new kitchen table, in the new flat, the one with the wide door and no stairs. She watched herself on screen with the curious detachment of someone watching a stranger in a familiar situation. She watched the court corridor. She watched Grace's face. She watched Daniel in his shirt. She watched the original footage, which the documentary opened with, as it had to. 7 seconds. The crowd. The sound. James Whitmore not moving. She sat with it. Outside, through the window, the street she was learning. Not her street yet, she'd only been here a few weeks, but becoming hers in the way streets do, slowly, by repetition. The shop on the corner she had already started going to in the mornings. The tree outside the building that was just beginning to come into bud. The neighbor on the ground floor who had introduced herself the second day and brought a plant as a welcome gift, a small green thing in a clay pot that Daniel had immediately named Gerald and positioned in the window where it caught the afternoon light. Gerald was there now. In the window. Catching the light. Margaret turned off the television. She sat for a moment in the quiet flat that had no stairs between her and her son. She thought about what she would tell people if they asked. What the real lesson was, the one you couldn't put in a headline or a 7-second clip. She thought about all the people still carrying folders like hers, still sitting in waiting rooms, still receiving letters that said deferred, still being redirected to other offices that had relocated without adequate notification. She thought about James Whitmore, somewhere in London, still working on his proposal about information cards. Still at it. Still going. She thought that the thing nobody talks about enough is how long it takes. Not the crisis is fast, the crisis is 7 seconds, the crisis is a slap and a sound and a crowd going quiet. The long part is everything before and everything after. The long part is the years of quiet trying. The long part is the sitting back down and starting again after the answer is no for the 47th time. The long part is what most people never see. She got up. She turned the kettle on. She knocked on Daniel's door and asked if he wanted tea. He said yes. She made 2 cups and brought his to him and they sat together in the living room, the new living room, no stairs, wide door, Gerald in the window, and watched something on television that had nothing to do with any of it. Outside, the street did its ordinary evening things. Somewhere in London, a guard stood at his post. Somewhere on the internet, the original clip still existed, still circulating at the slow pace of things that don't die but don't trend anymore either, just float there, findable, a record of a moment that looks simple from the outside. Nothing about it had been simple. Everything about it had been human. And that, in the end, is the only kind of story that matters.